Oh, hey, welcome back, Chappelle. All right, we have two special guests for this flip, right? We're going to pick up right where we left off in class. We've been talking about all this stuff about Rome, and these two are very, very excited to talk about Rome. I think it's been one of their favorites so far, even though they have French names. But this is Cosette, and this is Pierre, and these are the guys that we're actually fostering right now. They're about 5 weeks old, 6 weeks old, and they're very excited to talk about another big culturally Roman thing, right? So I've been telling them after I've been coming home from school and stuff that what we've been doing in our academic classes for Western Civ is we've been talking a lot about what makes Rome so different from all these other places, right? When we talked about Greece and when we talked about the Assyrians and the Egyptians and all these other people, the big things we've been talking about Rome have to do with like their culture, right? We've been talking about how they have a forum and how they have dictators during times of war and how they had a Republican-style government after they booted out the Etruscans, which is really important to remember, how the Etruscans affected them, where they settled in Italy, stuff like that. We've been basically just saying, like really, really kind of delineating them between the Greeks, right? Because a lot of people always say the Romans and the Greeks are just so similar and no. They actually aren't, right? Like, they have similar cultural things, but their structure of their government, how they vote, their stories, their history, all that stuff is extremely different, right? Very, very different. And one of the biggest ways it was different is the stuff that we just got done talking about in class, right? Talking about, like, the bread and circuses perspective of keep those plebes distracted. And we talked about the struggle of the orders and how those plebes are going to basically go on strike and refuse to fight in wars and also kind of refuse to participate in the economy until they're actually fully represented. And they actually ended up getting those things when plebes were allowed to marry patricians. They got the 12 tables posted in the forum, and they even also got tribunes added to the government that would have the power of the veto and be able to veto any law that would affect the patricians naturally, or the plebeians negatively, right? And then also they had two consuls, right? Like these two guys right here. Actually, the consuls, interestingly enough, could veto each other too, which is funny. And then even after the struggle of the orders, eventually what ends up happening as well is, write this down really quick, one of the consuls had to be a plebe, right? So like you saw all kinds of amazing big reforms going on and different things, and that's a big thing about Rome is their cultural ability to react to different stuff and kind of change over time. Now, another big thing we started talking about, though, is we did talk about how Rome is going to eventually, like, take over pretty much the entire Italian peninsula, right? They're going to take over the whole thing, and they're going to let and allow people to kind of keep their own rights. They're going to have a very strong military, but one of the biggest things that happens to Rome, like, historically speaking, is when they got into, like, basically the World War II of the ancient world, right? The biggest war the world had ever seen up until this point. And the people that they end up going against really actually kind of plays up against their whole divide, explore, and conquer perspective, right? So something that we have to kind of really understand before we ever even get into this entire segment of the flip is that the Romans never had any intention to grow as large as they did, right? Ironically enough, even though they are very divide and conquer perspective, isn't that right, Cosette? Even though they're very, very big about this divide and conquer idea with their legions and their really big military following the sack of the Gauls in 390 BC, the thing that you got to understand is that the Romans actually adopted this thing called defensive warfare, right? Defensive warfare and the idea of, like, we're not going to grow too big too fast, right? Like, Alexander the Great grew way too big, way too fast, and his empire ended up falling apart, right? So the Romans never actually planned on doing this. They kind of, like, accidentally tripped into a war against this other city-state that was over in North Africa, right? And that's going to lead to these things known as the Punic Wars, right? So the Punic Wars were this war that they kind of accidentally got themselves involved in, right? And it's started out basically because by 272 BC, the entirety of the Italian peninsula, pretty much except for the northern area, which was still under the control of the Gauls, the same people that actually kind of destroyed them and stuff in 390 BC. By 272, though, BC, everywhere except for northern Italy was under the control of Romans, right? And they were basically having all these different people that were pledging their allegiance to the Roman Empire, or the growing Roman Empire and the growing Roman, like, state. And so a rivalry, though, is going to develop between them. Not between the states, but between them, as in the Romans, and this other really big city-state in North Africa, right? So this is a really, really important moment in history, because this is one of those moments where if things had gone differently, this is like that Back to the Future moment that I talked about in C period, where, like, if one of these other guys had won, the drastic difference in our world today would be insane. We base our language off the Roman language with the Latin language. We base our government off the Roman government with their tiered system, their vetoes, their checks and balances, right? Their three-branch government system, because basically our president is just the two consuls and the dictator mushed together, right? So we base all of our different cultural things off the Roman Empire. But had they lost this series of war against these people over here in this, like, purple color, Carthage, everything would be wildly different, and we might be speaking different languages. We might have different governments. We might have different cultural ideas, right? Because what we do know in the long run, spoiler alert, is that the Romans are going to end up winning these wars, right? But a big thing about it is they almost didn't, right? So this rivalry developed between the Romans and the Carthaginians after the Romans had actually taken over the entire Italian peninsula, right? And Carthage is from North Africa. They're in modern day what's known as Tunisia, and they were actually founded by the Phoenicians. It's why the wars are named the Punic Wars, because the Latins actually called the Carthaginians Phoenicians, and in Latin that's called Punic, and then eventually it got changed to the word Punic, as in the wars against the Carthaginians or the wars against the Phoenicians, right? And all of this actually started out over Mediterranean sea trade control as well as just control of the Western Mediterranean in general. Now, funny enough, the entire thing about it too is that Carthage, as you can see, was a very, very developed city-state. Like this right here is what we believe Carthage looked like at the dawn of the Punic Wars, right? Which is actually pretty comparable to what we believe that Rome looked like at the dawn of the Punic Wars, right? Very, very large, industrious, but the Carthaginians, as you can tell, with their entire sea-exchanging wheel right here, were all based around trade, and they had a very, very large naval fleet, right? So they also had a very, very big infrastructure, but one interesting thing about Carthaginians, though, too, is that they didn't have their own army, actually. They would pay people to be their army members, these people called mercenaries, right? Where the Romans had an army. They had a citizen army, right? So the big thing, though, going into it is, as you can see, this whole thing is going to get pretty crazy pretty quick. Are you scared, Cosette, of war and stuff? So the whole thing is going to actually start out over this island right here, over the island of Sicily, right? So the First Punic War actually starts out over the island of Sicily, mainly just because it was a miscommunication between Carthage, Rome, and the city-state of Syracuse. So if you looked back at that map, you saw that not everything was purple and red, right? There was some beige, tan, unclaimed areas on that map, but then also there was that little bit of green, which is the city-state of Syracuse, right? Syracuse was a Greek colony, okay? So they actually paid tribute to their Greek descent, and the other big thing about it is that apparently Syracuse was being invaded or taken over by this group of Italian pirates, right? The Sicilian pirates. And so the interesting thing that happens is that they end up calling for aid from Carthage, and then the pirates end up being like, hey, Rome, why don't you come help us because we're Italians, right? And so what ends up happening is just through a lot of are we helping? Are we not helping? What are we doing here? A war breaks out, right? And it lasted for 20 years. And the very first Punic War was actually Rome and their allies with a small city of Syracuse, and they ended up actually winning the entire war, mainly because they actually developed a navy that the Carthaginians actually had. But so in the long run, Rome barely won this thing. And a lot of it was no fighting at all. They were kind of just waiting each other out the entire time. But one of the biggest reasons why Rome was able to win is because they engineered their very first naval fleet, right? So as we've been talking about this entire time, when we talked about the growth of the military after the sacking of the Gauls and stuff like that, the biggest thing that happens there, that if you notice, is that all those different units of their military, they were all land army units, right? Catapults are on land. The legions are on land. All that stuff, swords are used on land. The thing that Rome never had was a naval fleet, right? But because of the First Punic War, they end up building one. And the only way they figured out how to build one was creating boats like these. And have we seen these boats before? Yes, we have. That is an exactly right answer, Maddie Vault. That is 100% right. That right there is a trireme, right? So triremes were originally of Greek order. Greeks had actually developed them. But the Greeks showed the Phoenicians how to build them as well, and the Carthaginians ended up building them. The Romans had no idea how to make these things, but apparently during the First Punic War, even though they almost lost the First Punic War, they actually found several Carthaginian ships that had sunk or washed ashore in Italy, and so they just copied them, right? So actually the Roman Navy is just a copy of Carthaginian triremes, right? But after the First Punic War, things change up a lot, right? Rome takes control of Sicily, embarrasses Carthage really, really badly, and also puts a lot of salt in the wounds as well, in the sense that they also take these two islands away from Carthage, the islands of Corsica and Sardinia, right? So after the First Punic War, this rivalry gets even more intense. But it particularly gets more intense to one particular family, right? So there were these Carthaginian generals. One's name is Hamilcar, and the other's name is Hannibal, right? So Hamilcar is Hannibal's father, okay? So Hamilcar was one of the generals of a mercenary army in Carthage, okay? And so Hamilcar got really, really, really upset when he returned to Carthage after the First Punic War, and they were unable to pay him, right? So the thing about mercenary armies is you have to be paid for your services, right? You're basically like a soldier for hire. Hamilcar was one of these mercenary generals. He goes back to Carthage. He says, I demand to be paid because it wasn't my fault that we lost this war. Rome built a navy out of a bunch of our old ships and stuff like that, and it ended up beating us basically in a bunch of mishaps that y'all decided to do. So pay me. And then the Carthaginians were like, well, we can't pay you because we have to pay the Romans back. Because something you got to understand about wars is when you lose wars, you owe these things called reparations, right? So the Romans wanted things to be rebuilt and redone, and so they demanded the Carthaginians pay them. And so since the Carthaginians were paying Rome, they couldn't pay Hamilcar. So Hamilcar starts to really hate Rome, right? Hamilcar also believes that he didn't lose this war, that it was actually lost by the Carthaginians, and he also begins to despise Rome with a fiery passion. So what ends up happening is Hamilcar takes his son, Hannibal, and decides that he's going to go invade a very, very, very wealthy area of Spain that is home to a bunch of silver mines, right? So in the Second Punic War, what ends up going down is he goes over to Spain and he attacks it, right? He attacks Spain, Hamilcar does, the father of Hannibal. He attacks Spain with Hannibal at his side, and he ends up actually like taking over several small different areas of western Spain or eastern Spain to try and dig silver mines and make all this stuff so they can end up paying themselves and then also end up paying back the Romans as well. Now, funny enough, the war didn't actually break out very, very immediately. And also funny enough, there's a very big modern-day city known as Barcelona that's actually named after Hamilcar and Hannibal because their last name is Barca. And when they actually took over that land, they made a city called Barcalan, and then literally it ended up meaning, or like ended up evolving into Barcelona, right? So, but what ends up going down is basically Hamilcar freaks the Romans out because he took over a city-state that they believed belonged to them. It's called Saguntum, right? So they end up taking over the city, and the Romans declare war on them. Now, rewind a few years before this, and Hamilcar hates Rome, hates them with a fiery passion. And he also hates them so much that he made his son swear to hate Rome and to one day destroy them, right? So Hamilcar basically forced his son to sacrifice a lamb, and on that dead lamb's body, Hannibal, the son of Hamilcar, had to put his hand on it and say, I swear to forever hate Rome and never be a friend to Rome, right? So in this process, since Rome has now declared war on them in the Second Punic War, Hamilcar and Hannibal decide to split their forces into two, and they have a very, very intense strategy, right? So biggest ones happen when Hamilcar decides that he's going to stay in Spain and try to keep fighting the war there. Hannibal says he's going to march an army over the Alps, which has never been done before, right? He's going to take several thousand troops over the Alps, some of those troops on the backs of elephants, and try to march directly on the city of Rome. And he had some really massive victories early on. And also what was mind-blowing is Hannibal marched an entire army over the Alps, which had never been done before, right? And remember, Hannibal, Hamilcar, they're Carthaginian generals, right? So what ends up going down, though, is they had really big victories, and the Romans end up kind of sitting everything out and holding on. A lot of it due to actually this guy named Fabian, who ends up becoming their dictator, but you don't need to know that, right? So this is Hannibal actually crossing the Alps with his soldiers. Now, funny enough, a bunch of the elephants died, right? So, like, most of the elephants died. Some of them apparently slipped off the mountain, which I kind of find out a little bit hilarious, because can you imagine how slow a process that would be? But anyway, what ends up happening is not all the elephants made it. He only made it to Rome with about 26,000 soldiers, which was actually like only a fourth of the ones that he set out with, because the Alps ended up killing a bunch of Hannibal soldiers. But what was crazy is they still won, right? So like Hannibal actually led his military to very big victories against the Romans, and Hannibal ends up spending 16 years just destroying farms and cities in Rome. Hannibal legit lived in Rome for 16 years, wrecking house, trying to take over cities, and trying to convince those cities that Rome was actually their enemy, not their friend, right? And so the Second Punic War keeps raging on, and Rome was this close to losing, like this close to losing. Apparently, at one of the biggest battles, called the Battle of Cannae, what ended up happening is the Carthaginians beat the Romans so badly that the Carthaginians ended up taking a bunch of Romans as prisoners because their arms were tired from stabbing people to death, right? So Rome almost lost this thing, right? Was this close to losing the war against Carthage until this guy shows up. A stroke of genius held down by Scipio Africanus, right? Even though, ironically enough, his name wasn't Scipio Africanus yet, it was just Publius Scipio, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So Scipio Africanus is a Roman general, right? And he realizes in this moment that we are going to lose this war against Carthage if we don't do something drastic, right? And so what he decides to do is that he is going to strike out and take the war to Carthage rather than being this defensive war strategy that the Romans had adopted so much earlier. So Carthage was now controlled Spain, and Hannibal is wreaking havoc in Italy, right? So we know that Carthage was over in Spain under Hamilcar, but what ended up happening is Hamilcar actually drowned in one of the battles, so he was dead. And then Hannibal is wreaking havoc in Italy, burning farms to the ground and spending 15 years just destroying everything, right? Hannibal also, fun fact, lost one of his eyes actually during the campaign in Italy because he was actually trying to get to Rome through a swamp, and he ended up getting a disease or an infection inside of both of his eyes that was so bad that he had to cut one of his own eyes out because of the infection in there, right? So Hannibal was really struggling getting to Rome and destroying them, and he just spent 15 years just burning farms down and stuff like that. So the Roman general Scipio says, wait a minute, Spain is not defended by Hamilcar anymore. It's just got a couple of armies. So I'm going to take several legions and I'm going to go attack them directly instead of waiting on the Romans to attack, or waiting on the Carthaginians to attack Rome, right? And so what ends up happening is Scipio heads into Spain and he tries to Carthagify it, right? So he tries to basically get all the Carthaginians out of there, and over several years he does that, right? And then he decides that he wants to take the battle directly to them, right? Because Hannibal is just wreaking havoc throughout Italy over several, a 15-year war, right? And so what Scipio decides to do, he's like, wait a minute, if Hannibal's in Italy and Hamilcar's forces were in Spain, then who's protecting Carthage itself, right? So what he ends up doing is Scipio Africanus skips on down to northern Africa and decides that he's going to attack the city of Carthage directly and try to destroy it completely and force Hannibal to turn around, leave Italy to come back and protect Carthage. And that's exactly what happened. Hannibal was forced to return to Africa to defend Carthage's lands, and Carthage ends up giving up after they lost a massive battle, a humongously massive battle, to Scipio and his forces, known as the Battle of Zama, right? So, and Carthage ends up giving up in 202 BC and surrendering after literally basically winning this war for 90% of it. A big thing about the Romans is, are you sleeping now, Cosette? A big thing about the Romans is you have to understand they adapt very, very well, right? And so after the Battle of Zama, Hannibal's forces were decimated, and Hannibal actually had to flee and find another job in the kingdom because he got exiled out of Carthage altogether, right? He ended up dying as basically another mercenary soldier out in the eastern territories towards where Greece is now and also Turkey. Fun fact, actually, one famous thing that Hannibal was known for was actually that he came up with a strategy to attack a bunch of boats by throwing snakes at them, right? So he was like, if we just take a bunch of pots and throw full of snakes and throw it at the other boats, they'll be so scared of the snakes that we'll be able to go take them over, which is a little funny little anecdote about Hannibal, but he actually was a genius, all things considered, because he actually crossed the Alps with elephants, kept most of the elephants alive, or some of the elephants alive. He actually had an elephant that was his best friend, his pet Surus, and he actually also ended up cutting out his own eyeball from a swamp infection, which is gross. But anyway, so what ends up happening, though, is Rome wins, again, a second war, and ends up taking most of Carthage's lands in Spain and northern Africa, so their empire is growing, right? And then what ends up happening is, after about a 60-year-long break and allowing Carthage to just kind of exist, a lot of Roman generals and senators thought to themselves, why are we allowing this city to just keep eking on? Why are we allowing them to be big enough? What if they end up raising an army against us one day? So what they end up doing is they send Scipio Africanus's grandson, either son or grandson, to Carthage to destroy the city completely. Even the famous senator known as Cato the Elder would apparently always end all of his speeches with a Latin phrase that translated into English means Carthage must be destroyed, right? So, and they go in the Third Punic War and just absolutely wreck Carthage and leave it in complete ruins, right? Everyone that didn't die in that war, that wasn't killed during the war against Carthage, was sold into slavery, right? So Carthage, actually, all of their citizens get sold into slavery. And then what also ended up happening, according to legend, they hated Carthage so much that the Romans salted all of the land of Carthage so nothing would grow there ever again, right? So basically, Rome just eliminated their biggest rival from history altogether, right? They just sponged them out, which is absolutely crazy. And then following the Punic Wars, they set out and they start taking over and conquering even more things. They conquer Greece, Macedonia, parts of Southwest Asia, and all of those places started coming under the control of Rome, right? And they're going to start using diplomacy and threats during the Punic Wars, and they end up taking over more and more and more and more, right? And so after that, the Republic would then be divided into provinces, and a governor would be appointed to rule each one, and they were supposed to be subjects of the Roman Empire. And the people of the new provinces had to pay taxes, and some were also even taken into Rome as slaves, right? Which is a very, very important thing that you need to understand, especially when we get into the next stuff that we're going to talk about in class, because we're going to get into the effects of the Punic Wars and how that affected everything drastically, and how Rome was going to be yet again in need of some crazy reforms, right? So remember, Rome ends up winning all the Punic Wars against their enemy Carthage. Hamilcar and Hannibal end up almost beating Rome in the Second Punic War. Hannibal loses an eye. It's a fun fact. And then also Scipio Africanus took the fight to them, turned the tides of the war, and Carthage ends up falling. Don't forget that salting the earth thing too. It's a very big fact, and it actually pops up in one of the questions on the test itself. So I'll see you guys soon. I hope you enjoyed it. Y'all have a good one.